It's a short presentation, so don't worry. And I'll make it even shorter. But before we go into it, I'd like to give it a little bit of a spin, because it's a very important theme. And if there are scholars of Veda, of Vedic sciences, or Tantra, there is nothing new to hear here. So you might as well catch something else. But you may be in for a surprise, so pin yourself down and see what happens. Because the theme we are going to unpack here is relevant to absolutely all traditions, irrespective of their origin, irrespective where they come from, where they've originated, because it's simply something which connects us to the very way consciousness expresses itself as everything, absolutely everything. And as I said earlier, it's a very well-known topic for any scholar of Vedanta, Vedic knowledge or Tantra. It's very, very foundational, in fact. The ABCs of spirituality. The 4 levels of speech. Simply because, whether we like it or not, all processes of self-realization are essentially have to be experienced firsthand. In other words, that's the very meaning of the term gnosis. It's an ancient Greek term for the Sanskrit jnana. Jnana became gnosis. So all Gnostic spirituality, it's that. It's partaking directly in the knowledge of the self. That's what it is all about, essentially. And the 4 levels of speech introduces the platform which gives us a very, very valid understanding of how indeed consciousness expresses itself and how consciousness also becomes oblivion to its own luminosity, even if temporarily. So in other words, this platform of understanding does not bashes the usual suspects. The ego and the mind are no longer being held prisoners of bad behavior. No need to press any accusations against our individuality or the way we think. And therefore, we feel it is very conducive for this kind of gatherings, for this kind of events, because it gives us a slightly different perspective on the way consciousness has its, essentially, with its own self, because it's all self-referral, always self-referral. It is always in reference to its own self. It is never in reference to something else. But before we go into this, and I will, as I said, I will do it very short. It's quite a voluminous theme, but I will try to fit it within about 10 minutes so that we can have a bit more lively discussion and maybe again find something that is relevant to this gathering. But before we go into it, I'd like you to do a very short little exercise with me, a very short one, very simple one. I'd like you all now think of something, anything in fact, absolutely anything, it doesn't matter. Sky's the limit, anything. Can you do that? Great. If it helps, close your eyes, eyes open, it makes no difference. Just think of anything for a moment, okay? Good. Release it now. Release it now. Now think of a flower with me. Again, if you prefer to close your eyes, just imagine a flower. I'm not specifying, just a flower, whatever comes to mind. Let the term flower come and take over your thinking for a moment. Just for a moment. Okay? And release that. Release that now. Release that. One more time. I would like you to think of a particular flower with me. Let's think of a red rose. Can we do that? Okay? So let's together think of a red rose. Just picture that red rose with your mind, just using your own imagination. And now I would like you to say it with me to the count of 3, all together, like little children, right? We'll learn something. Red rose. 3, 2, 1. Rose. Beautiful. One more time.
Red rose.
Beautiful. Now, I would like you to think about red rose. And as you are about to say it, but you don't say it, as if like, oop, held your lips. 2, 3, 1. And release it now. Just that. Very simple, very innocent exercise. And I will try to make sense. I'll lose it all in a moment. Let's see how it goes. But essentially, it will be more apparent why we did that. So we'll leave that now, that little exercise to the side. And we'll speak about 4 levels of speech. 4 levels of speech with which absolutely all schools of Vedic and Tantric knowledge operate with. This is the very, very basic and the very basis of spirituality born on Indian subcontinent, but it is not a property of Indian culture, it's universal. And that's what we're trying to unpack here. Essentially, according to Vedic understanding, there are 4 distinctive levels. 4 distinctive levels of the way consciousness expresses itself. The first one is known as para. As simple as that, para. The second one is known as pashyanti. And the third one is madhyama, madhyama. With the fourth being vaikari, vaikari. Sometimes pronounced baikari, depends on the dialect. What are they? Essentially, para correlates to that where the self is in its state of total undifferentiation, where the source of energy and the energy itself is at a total repose. It is what we call a state of pure silence, the state of Parabrahman, in Indian spirituality often spoken, or pure awareness, para. There's nothing as yet happening, nothing at all. And then as we move towards the second stage, there is as if something about to happen. There is this quiver, there is this throb. There's movement. But not the movement in a physical sense, not like I move my hand now. It's movement within that which is pure awareness. It is immeasurably subtle. We could call it a formation of energy itself. A field of pure potentialities. What often scientists use this jargon these days, and I like that very much because it aptly stands for Shakti. If we are to translate it into the language of Tantrism. But, so the second level is that yet undifferentiated, extremely subtle, very, very, very refined, extremely potent, because as a pure field of pure potentialities, it's a plethora of everything. It contains absolutely everything in its potential, all-encompassing state. Then suddenly something begins to happen. At the level of Madhyama, which simply means that, middle, nothing else. Madhyama means middle, no more, no less. There is a distinctive movement towards something. In other words, the idea is born. The mind is born. The great mind that Buddhism is talking about. There is a definitive vector of direction. And that is at the level of Madhyama. As it reaches its fullness of expression at the level of what we call as the middle one, it then bursts forth into the fourth, known as Vaikari. In other words, it collapses into something very particular. It collapses into something which is by definition, has to have form. It is formed, as it were. And that is known in Vedic spirituality as the vocal or audible level of speech. Speech here, obviously, is in relation to no one but your own self, the self. And we can draw distinctions here, of course. And we can look into the paradoxes in a moment. But so that we don't understand speech here in terms of our everyday chatter. It includes that. It obviously encompasses that aspect. However, when we use that terminology, 4 levels of speech, it is in relation to the one and the only. The one and the only consciousness that expresses itself through 4 distinctively different phases of its own expression. Why is it important at all? Why this would make any sense in terms of, let's say, if I were to speak from the platform of my occupation, then why would that make any importance in the domain of spiritual sharing, transmission, imparting knowledge, or emptying the knowledge, whatever way you prefer it? It doesn't really, it means the same thing. Whether we're going to get to know ourselves or we're going to get rid of what we have known to know ourselves, it's all the same. The important thing here is that it is the way everything is expressed through the sound. And there is a motto that summarizes the essence of sacred geometry, which sounds something as the following. Any form in its essence is sound condensed as matter. Any form. Anything that is formed one way or the other. Anything that came into the form. Any form. The idea of God is a form. That the most cherished idea of God, it's still a form, a very subtle, extremely refined concept. It belongs to this category. It belongs to the category of the formation within consciousness that undergoes these 4 distinctive stages. And as it is with Vedic sciences, everything is interconnected. Everything is interconnected. I myself only understand the scratch level of that. But what I understand has been experienced firsthand, so it's not borrowed from the readily available material out there that one has to take on trust without further investigation. No, nothing is taken on trust. And the 4 levels of speech are intimately connected also to the concept of time, the Vedic concept of time. Vedic concept of time, as some of you may have heard, that operates with this very, very non-linear perspective, but more of a cyclical perspective, where time essentially is that, again, property of the self, which from the blink of an eye, that's actually a measure. In Indian spirituality, blink of an eye is not just a physiological functioning, it's a measure of time. From the blink of an eye to infinity. And the deities are just introduced to make it easier, to make mathematical equations. The day of Brahma, it's all the 4 yugas, right, forming the cycle of Kalpa. And the lifetime of Brahma is the day of Vishnu, and the Vishnu's span life is equivalent to the Shiva opening his 3rd eye and closing it, speaking mythological language. However, in relevance to this theme, the 4 yugas or the 4 ages that are also could be found, the allusions to this could be found in Western spirituality, simply known as the Golden, Silver, Bronze, and Iron Ages, found their expressions or are the expressions of these 4 levels of speech. Whereas the Golden Age corresponds to the para. The silver, that would correspond to the Pashyanti, and Madhyama to the bronze, and therefore the one we live in now, the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, would correspond to the age of Vaikari. Again, why to bother? Why we even go there? It is essentially understood that at a certain time, at a certain cyclicity of time, certain frequencies dominate. Certain frequencies of the speech within the self becomes dominant. And ours is the time when everything is dominated by the 4th. Everything is dominated by the oral expression. In other words, the age we live in is dominated by the language. It is simply the inevitable necessity of time. The inevitable necessity of time. And yet, and this is where perhaps the relevant or more relevant part comes in. No matter what is being expressed through and on the level of Vaikari is a distorted version of para. By the time the impulses, the creative impulses rising spontaneously, continuously within consciousness, reach that surface level of self-expression at the level of the 4th, at the level of Vaikari, the truth is distorted. In other words, the most advanced, the most eloquent spiritual dialogue, it's essentially an opaque version of reality. And that's why this theme is important. That the language, by the way language forms, opaques reality, it dresses reality, it makes it, it renders it less transparent. And that is the very nature of Vaikari. That is the very nature of Vaikari. In other words, in the context of this conference, for instance, where the science is very prominent and also what we hope is the avant-garde of today's science, to understand or draw the separation or draw the line. So how do we understand? What is it, all these mythological allusions, to para pashyanti madhyama Vaikari? How do I understand that in modern language? That would amount, the closest equivalent here is that para and pashyanti belong to the field of pure potentialities, waves in its state as waves before they collapsed into anything. But at the level of madhyama, waves begin to collapse into something particular. Waves begin to collapse into that what we know as this audible, visible, perceivable reality. And not just audible, visible, perceivable through the five senses, opraches. No. As I said earlier, the concept of God also belongs to that. Because soon as it is on the level of madhyama, it is already a collapsed wave. It is already something which is particular. It's lost its all-encompassing freedom, even if temporarily, in order for something to come into being. And that is very relevant. I want to make a pause here. This is very relevant. In order for something to appear, anything, there has to be a sacrifice. And this is a very deep, esoteric, spiritual, metaphysical understanding of relationship between this and that. Between that absolute and this relative, between this or that silence and this dynamic phases of the self. In order for something to take shape, form, it would have to be a sacrifice of the totality. The totality sacrifices itself just as that myriad of waves, the ocean of waves, collapses into something particular. Something which can be known as having a particular form, a particular appearance, flavor, resonance, what have you. So this stand view has always been understood that language, no matter how profoundly evolved it is, it's always an imperfect tool, if you will, in the hands of consciousness itself, where it fully draws the wools over its own eyes. If you will, this is where the Maya, the concept of Maya, comes into being. And language only from there on reinforces that. The exercise we did earlier will make sense as we develop this. Anything that exists in form exists by virtue of a language and through the language. And language here to be understood as, again, a frequency in consciousness. Yet it's a frequency at a level where it is collapsed into something particular. And going back to these 4 yugas, 4 ages, the time that we live in, it's the time where there's no communication possible, other than exceptions that actually justify the rule, unless it is given to the language. And that is, in a way, the limitation of our time, which would have to do and deal with. And many spiritual traditions understand this fact very well, that nothing of a true spiritual revelation can ever be expressed through language. Even when it is given to the mother tongue of the prophet, it is still a concession in consciousness. So even when in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, it's already the fourth. It's already finger pointing. It's not what it is. We could speculate that perhaps in other yugas, other times, the frequencies were so much finer that there was no necessity for language. Certainly there was no necessity for any spiritual disciplines or religions. Religions arise historically, precisely at the time when Pashyanti collapses into Madhyama. You can use your own investigations into that and see how true or not that is, that the rise of religions, the most ancient ones, happens at the time when we no longer vibrate with finer frequencies of which we are its pure expression. But by the time we find ourselves in this day and age, we are fully subjected to these frequencies. Because these frequencies dominate absolutely everything. We're swimming in them. These are the waters, like the fish in the ocean. So we are subjected to these frequencies. And if you will, the very concept of Dharma, so dearly held in all Oriental and Occidental esoteric traditions, is precisely rests on this understanding that it is up to then, the most evolved consciousness, to uphold the field, because the field is flabby. It's no longer, there's not enough music. The notes, the strings are not tuned enough. It has to be constantly adjusted, constantly. How does it sound? How the key, yes, yeah. That's what is the true meaning of spiritual practice. Not just viewed from deeply subjective, existential perspective of my self-realization. I want to be free. In terms of the bigger picture, the spiritual practices, above all else, were understood from the perspective of the community doing it together, so that the field is more tuned in with that which is by then lost to the grosser or more dense vibrations. It is from that perspective that I wanted to speak on the 4 levels of speech. That language always conceals reality. And any one of you who's sitting here, who undergone through whatever degree of awakening, knows how utterly ridiculous it is to even begin to speak of spiritual breakthrough. Nothing language can tell us, nothing language informs us when we, let's say, come out into that, what would be now used as mundane consciousness. Whatever your background, tradition, let's say you came out of that Nirvikalpa Samadhi for the first time. Nothing. How on earth can I say that even in my movement? How can I say that even with those I've been meditating for 25 years or 25 months? It refuses to be spoken, because the experience belongs to much deeper level. On a daily basis, there's no problem. We can communicate. We can be so rude or polite, doesn't matter. We can be educated or totally out of it. On the gross level, it's all the same. Makes no difference. Yes, there is Blake. Yes, there is Wordsworth. There is Shakespeare. Yes, there is Ramayana. There is Iliad. There is Odyssey. But guess what? All this was born precisely from these deeper waters of consciousness. It all have risen not from the surface level. I just wanted to mention it as a footnote, in case someone wonders, oh, wait a minute, what about these great expressions of the language? Of course they are. Language full of that. Every language, whichever language we go, we can find these expressions, these fine expressions. And yet, no matter how dear that is, it is still Vaikari. Who was it that said that? Beethoven, correct me if I'm wrong. That nothing compares to silence, and no note, no music, in terms of its beauty. Music is no exception. It's the same, absolutely the same. The language and the music is just a different language to the language that we speak on a daily basis. So the 4 levels of speech is just essentially, it's that platform of understanding. It's not the ego, it's not the mind, they are just the instrumentalities, the willing, in fact, instrumentalities, the tools with which consciousness expresses itself through this living organism, as this living organism. They cannot be held responsible. But the predicament rises when consciousness temporarily spills itself out at that level, surface level of Vaikari, and it needs to find its way to that vertical dimension. Because up until it is on the horizontal dimension of the collapsed, anything that exists is already collapsed. The Andromeda galaxy, anything, any idea that comes into our mind, it's already something collapsed. It's already consciousness limited to itself. Any concept, no matter how wonderful, any concept, no matter how profound, is a collapsed consciousness onto itself. Collapsed in terms of collapsed into something particular. So I just wanted to speak about it a little bit, and very few minutes left. So if there are any questions that immediately need to be answered, or something that you would like me to reflect back, I'll be very happy to do that.
I'm still curious why at the beginning of the speech you start talking about this 4 letter, you start from the top, and then you go, let's say, to the bottom. There is some reason for that.
Well, in fact, there's no bottom or top. And I love that question because it allows me to elaborate a little more. I love the question, don't get me wrong, but there's no top or bottom. It's like, no, it's a limitation of the language. It's a perfect example. It's not your language. Well, English is not my first language. Obviously not your first language, but even if we speak Italian, Russian, or what have you, Farsi, that will be up against the same predicaments. No language is there. Sanskrit perhaps is the nearest language to the truth simply because of its structure. It carries the name and form in the closest coherence, that the term Namarupa. But what you've asked, there is indeed even location of these sounds or location of these levels within the physiology. But this has to be understood with a pinch of salt. In other words, not take them literally. And you can find allusions in various cultures. You can find this in ancient Gnostic Christianity, where the sound itself rises from. The para, the Pashyanti, the Madhyama, and finally, as the speech itself, as Vaikari, that is produced by manipulating, essentially, air through our vocal and nasal passages. That's what speech is about. It's something that eagers to break through. The air simply pushes it. Yoga speaks about it with precision. If we had more time, for instance, there is this quality of energy known as udana prana. Right? You've heard the term prana. There are different energetic currents that made this body perform its functions. And the fifth most important pranas in the body, precisely deals with self-expression as the language. It circulates from the solar plexus up to the nasal passages in the nose. It's how language itself, essentially, is being vocalized. This is even a biological, if you will, mechanics, or the mechanics of the biological way in the way that we speak. It's governed by a specific quality of energy. So in relation to that question, there's no such thing like, yes, we can speak in terms of where the para rises, right? And that could be maybe even experienced in terms of this deeply absorbed, these states of deep absorption. And yet, the tradition itself transcends that understanding. That the one who arrives at the level of para finds that everything is held in para, as in the heart of consciousness. It is located and not simultaneously. Just as Ramana Maharshi spoke of the spiritual heart, and people asked the students, so how do I locate that? Is it, because the description is given in the scriptures. In Kashmir Shaivism, they speak about the same, one-to-one, just a couple of digits of the medium line to the right. And yet Ramana Maharshi's response was, no. It's everywhere. For the Jnani, for the man who knows it, experienced everywhere. Because para transcends the verticality and the horizontality. It reconciles it. It's another meaning of the cross for you. It reconciles that vertical and the horizontal dimension of what we call existence. Reconciles it entirely. Transcends and reconciles it. So there is no such thing where para is located in relation to Vaikari. It is only in relevance or in reference to where consciousness currently finds itself. Therefore, here we address this. But we obviously apply the same understanding here, that everything that is now being spoken, it's already a distorted truth, a figment of it, a sliver of energy released, and it has to go haywire because that's the nature of Vaikari. The greatest sage of the time, when he or she speaks, always suffers the same thing. This is why there is this tradition of those who do not speak, or very reluctant to speak. This is why spiritual transmission transcends the limitations of the language. There is this, the real practice is not what you hear. You hear that again, you hear that again. It makes sense. But what it does, it moves from one compartment of the brain to another. It maybe clears up this cortex of our brains, but it reshuffles it somewhere else. The most profound spiritual understanding still falls short to the actual realization, the cognitive realization. So therefore, this explanation aims to somehow locate that, so that there is no propensity to, nothing needs to be done, I'm already that, this is that. Yes, but. And everything in that but. That's not your 24/7 experience. If it was, there will be none of this. There will be none of this conference. No necessity for speaking. We would have communicated in a different way, rather than vibrating air around. Even reciting Shakespeare, I would have heard Shakespeare now in my own heart, probably somewhere at the break of para into the Pashyanti age. Just saying. Please, I don't know who raised the hand first, so can you?
I just have a very quick question. It's probably out of my own ignorance, but you mentioned that there was a golden age, a silver age, a bronze age, and an iron age.
Yeah.
So I asked some other people also, and I never heard of the golden or silver age. Maybe you could elaborate more. Just simple and
Sure. Well, golden age, it's just, I didn't want to burden you with too much Sanskrit terminology. You see, in reference to the Vedic concept of time, which is cyclical, not linear. It's not linear. It's not like, okay, something happened and the dinosaurs lived there, and then, or even we go before that. It's not like that. It's like coming from within itself through cycles. One cycle replaces another cycle, like in a donut, if you will. And frequencies are different through different cycles. frequencies. Golden Age is simply known as that where the natural laws, that what upholds everything, is present at every fiber. In other words, nothing, no part violates the whole. This is a good one. No part violates the whole. Everything vibrates in pure and perfect synchronicity. When that happens, there is no road signs, there are no testaments, there is no need for them, no commandments, no yamas, no yamas. That is Golden Age. You see, if you prefer the Sanskrit terms, you can replace them. There are a few hands behind Peter.
Hello. First of all, thank you for this whole speech. I have a question because I'm actually had to study a bit of Asian language. I was reading one of the oldest scripts from I Ching, which perhaps some people might know that. And also, I'm here in Italy, which I know is also where the Latin language was born. And what is to my curiosity is also to see how language has been evolved through thousands of years. And apparently some of the I would say nowadays we don't speak Latin anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't speak the way that was being written in I Ching anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But there's always this kind of there was this kind of concrete information or knowledge, or you can also call it wisdom, was within this type of writing or this kind of construction of the words. So I have my question to you is that what do you see the future of language? How we are going to be communicated?
Beautiful. Yeah, I love this question. Beautiful. First of all, in reference to the way you developed the question itself, and Latin, as we know, was born from ancient Greek, literally. Latin is a natural progression, transformation of the ancient Greek into Latin. Is known to all scholars, all linguists. And ancient Greek came from nowhere but Sanskrit. So we could say that we live now, the group of Indo-European languages, right, that are prevalently spoken in Europe, for instance, and the rest of the world as a result, right? You can group them together. They are diluted oral expressions of much more ancient languages where the correlation between name and form remains more intact. That more is in brackets. If you like it, leave it there. And Sanskrit is one of those unique languages because of its inherent structure. It is peculiar that both ancient Greek flourished and died, so was Latin. They calcified to themselves and they became the domain of academics, and academies. Nobody speaks Latin today, unless they are not in their right frame of mind. So is ancient Greek. However, the Sanskrit is still recited on a daily basis. Sanskrit is as alive and kicking as it was 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And the time goes back. Some say it is because it's inherent in the structure of the language. Sanskrit, by the way, it's that which allows the light to pass through. That's what the meaning of Sanskrit. That which allows the light to pass through. In Sanskrit, the frequency of the term with which Sanskrit operates correlates to what it stands to, for what it stands. It's in the most intimate way. In other words, that meaning and form has not been distorted to a degree as it happened with further unfoldment and development of the languages. There may be some other languages existed and still do exist that we are not aware or do not know, obviously. But we do know that Sanskrit is such language. The whole mantric science is based on that. the power of the mantric science, the power of the matrika, which is an inseparable part of the Vedic and Tantric spirituality, rests upon that. They are like shortcuts because they go straight to the matrix. They connect us straight to the very matrix out of which the fiber of this existence is woven, like out of vowels and consonants. Right? K. An open vowel, open sound represents the quality of Shiva, the quality of pure awareness. There's no end to There is an end to my breath, but never end to is it not? And the consonant comes and it collapses sound immediately into something. K. Right? Or any other consonant. This is, by the way, also in line with it. Richo Akshare Parame Vyoman. It's one of the verses of the Veda that the true knowledge is in the gaps between the sounds, where all the impulses of creative intelligence, aka divinities, reside. The one whose awareness is open to that field. What is the use of recitation of the Vedas? And for the one whose awareness is not open to that field, Vedas are not helpful either. So, I don't know if I'm taking your your question in the right way, but it feels to me as a very, very interesting proposition here. Where does the language goes? Unfortunately, from what I feel myself and what I hear, what others lament, is that we live at a tremendous deterioration of language. In other words, our language goes through a greater simplification, but not in a good way. And that in itself moves us more and more to the surface level of Vaikari itself, because obviously there are degrees in that. There's no such thing like Vaikari is not homogeneous, so is the Madhyama is not homogeneous. That obviously goes without saying. There are degrees of that ignorance in Vaikari, the degree of opacity. So I hope that with consciousness being on the rise, and if indeed there is this shift in paradigm, that would necessitate somehow the transformation within language itself. How it will happen? It will happen on that level where those who are awakened to that field of which this Vedic verse speaks of, Ak, right? That the open sound which stands for Shiva, and the collapsed sound, that stands for Shakti. It is the vertical and horizontal dimension. It is that what the matrix of creation made out of. In other words, everything, every element, subtle essence of water, so is the gross essence of water, made out of the matrix of Shiva Shakti, pure awareness in the field of pure potentiality. So is everything else. So is our language. But applying this understanding of the fourth as being the grossest one. And if the language does not have that ability to allow the light to pass through, and that what is known in Indian spirituality so intimately as Namarupa. Namarupa is literally Nama Rupa, two words, two terms. Nama is a name and Rupa is a form. It's an intimate unity. It's a union between name and form. Unity. Coherence between name and form. Inseparable. And for the form, Namarupa is one term. It's the sum total of Namarupa is greater than the parts that this word is made of. So, where the language goes, I hear not such good news. That language goes through deterioration. And at the same time, I do hold hopes that with the awakening of consciousness that manifests through as every living being individual in this room and beyond, the language itself, there will be this undergoing transformation where it doesn't matter, Russian, Italian, English, French, so forth, something will happen, because we will speak not from the surface level of Vaikari only, but there will be a propensity to actually draw a bit of a deeper breath and speak from at least Pashyanti, if not Para. But we have to now close this gathering. I'm sorry if I didn't have a chance to take questions, but
Thank you very much.
thank you. Thank you, everyone.